All right, now we are on to section 5.2, adding and subtracting decimals. It begins on page 359. So section 5.2, adding and subtracting decimals on page 359. So adding decimals and subtracting decimals is very basic. It's just like adding and subtracting whole numbers. You line them up, place value to place value. You carry where needed, you borrow where needed. So this should be a pretty basic section for you, and you just need to practice your addition and subtraction skills. So I'm doing example 1 on the page of bottom of page 359. It's 3 and 125 thousandths, added to 4 and 814 thousandths. So notice I line them up place value to place value on the decimal, is what's usually said. The ones over the ones, the tenths over the tenths, the hundredths over the hundredths, and the thousandths over the thousandths. And then you just add as you normally would. 5 and 4 is 9. 2 and 1 is 3. 1 and 8 is 9. Carry down the decimal. And 3 and 4 is 7. So not very difficult. If you need to carry, you go ahead and carry. Let's try, let's do an example on, on page 360, where you have to add 7.5 and 12.23. Well, we can put them in any order. You can write the 7.5 first or the 12.23. The book decides to write 7.5 first. Then they write the 12.23 under it, lining up the decimals. Notice that the 5 is right over the 2. The 5/10 is over the 2. There's nothing next to it. You can put a placeholder 0 there. Remember, that just makes it equivalent in the right place value. You're just building it up. So then that lines everything up for you. 0 plus 3 is 3. 5 plus 2 is 7. 7 over 2 is 9. And then you have your 1. So that's showing you that you can arrange them in vertical format and then use placeholders. On page 361, there's three numbers there. We have 12.2, so I'm just going to start by writing out my 12.2. Then 8.352, so I just line them up decimal to decimal very carefully. Then 22.44. So I can put placeholders all over the place, placeholder zeros. I can put 2 of them up for 12.2 and make it 12 and 200 thousandths. And then I can put 1 on my 22.44 and put a 0 at the end. So everything lines up vertically. And I have a 2, a 9, and then a 9, and then a 10, 12, carry your 1, right? And then you have a 4. So you should have 42 and 992 thousandths. So it's just being very careful with lining up your decimals and your place values. You can do them in any order, left to right, because of the commutative and associative property. You can line them up in any order, but when you subtract, you need to make sure you subtract them in the order that you're asked to do it in. So example 5 on the bottom of page 361 says subtract 12.23 from 33.57. So we write 33.57 and we subtract 12.23 from it, right? So we're going to write 33.57 first and subtract 12.23 from it. In subtraction, it makes sense to take the smaller one from the larger one so that you can do your algorithm with lining them up vertically. So 7 minus 3 is 4, 5 minus 2 is 3, carry down your decimal, 3 minus 2 is 1, and 3 minus 1 is 2. So all you're doing is lining it up on the decimal, lining up place value to place value, and then using your steps, your algorithm that you've learned all along for subtracting numbers. Notice on page 362, there is 13.3 minus 8.572. So we're going to go 13.3, and then we're going to line up 8.572 underneath it on the decimal. You've got to put your placeholders in there after your 3 on your 13.3. Then you notice, oh, okay, I got to do some regrouping, some borrowing. I can't take 2 from 0. I got to go all the way over to my 3 and make that a 2. Carry that 1 right next to it and make it 10. Regroup that to a 9 and carry my 1 next to the 0 again. So same thing that you've been doing with whole numbers all along. So 10 minus 2 is 8. 9 minus 7 is 2. Then notice you can't take 2 minus 5, so you need to go regroup the 3 in the 1's place to a 2. Carry that 1 over and make it 12. 12 minus 5 is 7. Carry down the decimal. And then 12 minus 8 is 4. So you'd have 4.728. So it makes you practice that regrouping and the regrouping with your zeros. Now then it heads into negative number land again, and this is where you got to kind of switch gears and think negative numbers and think smarter a little bit. If we have negative 3.2 plus open paren negative 18.95. This is example 7 on page 362. Well, you notice you have two negative numbers. You would add them together, right? If you're at negative 3.2, you're going to go negative 18.95. You're going to go further down on the negative side. So you're just going to add these together and keep it negative. So you line up 18.95 plus 3.2 at a placeholder, and you get 5, 11, carry the 1, 12, carry the 1, 22.15, and then remember, put a negative next to it because you're reminding yourself that they were both negative. So this is where you've got to really think about your positives and negatives and what you're doing here. So it wasn't subtraction, it was actually adding two negatives. On the next page, on page 363, example number 8, it has negative 3 plus 2.24. So you notice you have a positive 2.24 and a negative 3. So actually you're finding the difference between these two numbers, and you're going to make it negative because you notice that the negative 3 is a greater absolute value. You have more negative than you do a positive, but you're still going to find the difference between the two. So you're going to line them up. 3.00 over 2.24, you're going to subtract them. So you got to do a little bit of borrowing. 10 minus 4 is 6, 9 minus 2 is 7. So you have 0.76, and then you got to remember to put a negative next to it because the negative 3 there's more negatives than there is positives. Think if you owed somebody $3 and you paid back $2.24, you're still going to owe 76 cents. So you still got to kick in those positive negative number rules when you do these and decide if you have to find a difference or add them together and which sign you need to keep. Also on example 9, it has negative 8.567 minus open paren negative 12.3 close paren. This is a no negative, isn't it? So it's actually a positive 12.3 and a negative 8.57. So we're going to find the difference between these two, aren't we? And we know it's going to be positive because there's more positives than there are negatives. So we go 12.300 minus 8.567. I put two placeholders in there to make it the same place value. We're going to have to borrow quite a bit on the top there because those two zeros. We got the 10 minus 7 is 3, 9 minus 6 is 3. We got to borrow again. 12 minus 5 is 7, and then 11 minus 8 is 3. And we know that it's positive because 12.3 is positive, more positives than the negative 8.567. All right. You will also have a little bit of order of operations involved in this where they might use some parens, like example 10 on the bottom of page 363. It has negative 11.2 minus open paren negative 8.45 plus 2.7 close paren. So you do in the parentheses first. You notice you have a negative 8.45 and a positive 2.7. So you're going to find the difference between those two, but keep them positive. It's got to do a little bit of work to do that subtraction. I'm just lining them up and finding that it's 5.75, but it's negative 5.75, isn't it? Because I had more negatives than positives. I put that in my parentheses and I pull down the minus and I pull down my 11.2 and I notice, oh, I've got a minus negative. I've actually got a positive situation. 11.2 minus a negative 5.75 is actually 11.2 plus 5.75. So I have two different signs again. I'm going to find the difference between the two numbers, but it's going to be negative this time because the negative 11.2 has more negatives than the positive 5.75. So we do the math on 11.20 minus 5.75, and we end up with negative 5.45. All right. So that's on the bottom of page 363, and it goes over to 364. So it's just being very careful with reminding yourself what's going on with the positives and the negatives. And then finally, the final example is some absolute value practice on page 365. Example 11, we have negative 12.3 minus the absolute value of negative 4.6 minus open paren negative 2.84 close paren. All right. So we're going to treat this grouping symbol, this absolute value, like a grouping symbol, and then we'll apply the absolute value to it. So notice we have negative 4.6 minus a negative 2. That's a no negative, right? So we have two signs. We got to find two different signs. We got to find the difference between them. And then we know it's going to be negative because it's a negative 4.6 is more negatives than our positive 2.84. So I'm doing the math, lining them up, place value to place value, and just doing the subtraction. You can do this all day long. I remind myself it's negative, but now I have an absolute value of it, which actually means that it's positive, doesn't it? The absolute value of negative 1.76 is actually positive. So I'll just get rid of those absolute values in my negative sign, and I actually have a positive 1.76. So I have negative 12.3 minus 1.76, which means I have two negatives that I'm going to combine together, negative 12.3 and a negative 1.76. So 12.3 and a 1.76 combined together, I'm going to add them, and then I'm going to make it negative because they're both negative. I'm going further down the negative line. So that's where you're going to have to do, again, like I keep saying, really stop and think about what's happening with your positives and your negatives, and thinking about if you're finding the difference, and does it stay negative? Is it positive? Am I combining two negatives? I've got to add them together, but then make sure the answer is written as a negative at the end. So be very, very careful. The math is actually probably pretty simple. It's making sure you're thinking about what's going on with the positives and the negatives. So that is section 5.2. So you're set to do your homework for that section, and you'll be ready for next class when we launch into 5.3. So have a good study session and practice, 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 and we'll see you next class.